Howdy. This is Mr. Potter. We're going to continue talking about our inheritance and polymorphism and the idea of the super uh, uh, keyword. Not only how the super constructor, which is really what we emphasized in our previous lesson, but how we can talk about super methods to access the previous methods and how those get taken care of. So what I've got here is I'm going to be constructing three classes. So here's my base class. So I'm going to have public class alpha. And inside this class, I'm just going to create two methods. So I'm going to have public void M1. And what this is going to do is something we'll decide later. And I'm going to have public void M2. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this code and I'm going to copy it into a public class. Come on. Class beta extends alpha. And I'm going to include these method headers. So we are, in fact, overwriting these. And I'm going to do the same thing for my gamma. So I've got public class gamma extends beta. And we're going to paste that in as well. So what I'm going to do is gamma is going to call on beta's M1. So I'm going to do super dot M1. And so that's going to call on beta's M1. And then I'm just going to do system.out.print an X. And similarly, my M2 is going to call on super.m2. And I'm going to have system.out.print a Y. Because what I'm interested in is how these things actually get taken care of when I call in an object and it calls on a subsequent object and it calls on a subsequent object. Because it's interesting to see how that tracing actually occurs. So in my beta, I'm going to take these M's that we've got. And in this one, I'm going to system.out.print an I first, and then I'm going to call super.m1. And in this, I'm going to do the super.m2 system.out.print J. So the idea is that when I call on something from the gamma class, and the super is going to call on the same method from the beta class, but because I'm using system.out.prints, all of these letters are going to be concatenated, and I'm going to be able to see the order in which things happen. So my public class alpha, its M1 is just going to have a system.out.print A. In my M2, I'm going to have it system.out.print B, and then I'm going to say M1. So what's going to happen is that it's going to call on this print, and it's going to print the letter B, and then it's going to call on the M1 for whatever class called it, and that's really what's going to be interesting here. So I'm going to go ahead and compile this. We're just waiting for it to compile. Compile beta. And compile gamma. And then in my alpha beta gamma driver, so I've got public class ABG driver. I'm just going to have a public static void main string args. And I'm going to create some objects. So I'm going to say, alpha A1 gets new alpha. And then I'm going to have A1 call on its M1 and see what the result is. And then I'm going to do a system.out.print line. Decimal point would help there. And then I'm going to have it call on A1's M2 method. So we're going to run this, and it should be fairly predictable what's going to happen. When I tell A1 to run its M1 method, it's just going to print an A. And when I tell A1 to run its M2 method, it's going to print a B, and then call on its own M1 method, which should print an A. So we're going to go ahead and compile this. And run it, it should be pretty predictable. I should see A, and then I should see BA. So pretty much what I expected here. All right. So what I want to do now is I want to create an alpha object called A2, which is going to get a new beta. And so what's interesting to note here is that A2 is an alpha box, but A2 contains a beta object. So when I tell A2 to do its M1 method, and we'll go ahead and system.out.println just to give it its own little thing. When A2 calls on M1, beta is going to print out an I and then call on super M1, which should print out an A. So I should see IA in that order. So let's test it out. Okay. So there's the A and the BA, and there's the IA that we're expecting. Where things get interesting is when I tell A2 to do its M2 method. So what we're going to do is we're going to run it, and we're going to explain what's happened here. So notice what we get. We get B, I, A, and J. So A2 is an A2 object. And we're calling on M2's method, but keep in mind that A2 really contains a beta. So we look at beta's method, and it calls on super M2, which is going to call on alpha's M2, which prints a B. And then it calls on M1, but keep in mind this object is a beta. So M1 is in the beta class, and it's going to go over to beta and print out the letter I. That's why I is the second thing that's printed here. And then it calls on super.m1, so it jumps back to alpha's M1 and prints out the A. And at this point, it has completed alpha's M2. So it's completed the super M2 call. So now it needs to complete its own call. And so J ends up being the final thing printed here. And so that's how come I end up with this BIAJ pattern. Now, a good question would be, let's go ahead and put a system.out.println here. if I were to create a beta object called B1, which is going to get a new beta, and I told B1 to do its M2, would I get the same result? That's the big question that we have. So it seems like we should, because if beta is calling on its methods in order, I should get the exact same result. And in fact, I do. So then let's go ahead and take a look at our gamma class. So I'm going to go ahead and say alpha A3 gets new gamma. So now A3 contains a gamma object. So system.out.println just to make everything on separate lines. And I'm going to tell A3 to do its M1 procedure. And of course, let's trace through this and see what should happen. Gamma has an M1 procedure. And the first thing it does is it calls on its super. So we go to beta, and the first thing that beta does is it prints out the letter I, then it calls on its super, and that pops over to alpha, which prints the letter A, and this M1 method is finished, so that means beta's super call is done, and that means it's done. So now we return control to gamma. We've completed the super call, and now we print out the X. So I should see an I followed by an A followed by an X. So let's just verify if that's what we actually have here. And so I see the I, A, and X. So now let's do one more of these. We're going to do system.out.println. And we're going to do A3.M2. We're going to trace through it, see what we should expect. And we're going to run it to verify that that's what we do. So gamma has an M2 method. The first thing it does is it calls on super M2. So we're going to go to super M2, and first thing beta does is calls on its super M2. So we pop up to alpha, and alpha is going to print out a letter B. So letter B is the first thing that's done, and then we go to M1. M1 goes to gamma's M1 because this is a gamma object that we're calling the method on. So it calls on super M1. We go to beta, which is going to print out the letter I. So we have a B and then an I. Then we call on super's M1, and we go to alpha. So this is going to print out the A, and alpha's M1 method is done, so the call to super is done, which means beta's M1 is done. And we go back to gamma, which prints out the letter X. And this M1 call that we did all the way back here in alpha is done. So now we can complete this. So what we have so far is that we have the B, then we had the super call, then we had the I, then we had the A, and then we have the X. So I have BIAX, and now we're completing gamma calls backwards. So from here, we've completed this M2 call. So now we're jumping back. We're going to print the letter J, and that completes this M2 call. And then we're going to go back here and print out the Y. So let's verify if that's what I actually have. So let's compile this. Let's put a semicolon there instead of a colon. And run it. And so I end up with B, I, A, X, J, and Y, which is pretty much what we expected. The B comes from this M2 call. Then we trace through the M1s, which is the super call, the I, the A, and then we trace our way back, X. And that completes the alpha call. So now we jump back to the beta call, which is the J, and then the gamma call, which is the Y. It's helpful to know how these subclasses interact with each other when I create these objects. And keep in mind that the result is exactly the same, even if this was a gamma object. So gamma G1 gets new gamma. And I do the exact same thing with G1.M2. I should end up with the exact same thing. So notice the result is exactly the same whether it's an alpha object or a gamma object. What's important is what's inside the box, not necessarily what's on the outside of the box. So I wanted to go through this demonstration of what we do when we do a super method call. And I'm hoping it made it a little bit clearer to what the expected behavior is. It gets a little quirky, especially when the methods start interacting with each other, but I did want to go through an example of it. Tracing it, by hand, and then also running it to see what the expected behavior is. So, once again, this is Mr. Potter. Thank you for watching. Have a great day.